Hello friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Steph. So today we are doing my April 4 and 5-star reads, but we are also going to go over my quarter one stats. This is a little late. I didn't know if I wanted to do this or not, but I do want to do my stats, if only to be able to tell you how many books that I had at the beginning of the year versus how many books that I have now. So the first part of this video will be the books that I read in April that were 4 and 5-star reads, and then we will move into the quarter one stats. So the first book that I finished this month was actually a 5-star read. It was maybe my second 5-star read of the year, and that is The Vanishing Birds by Simon Jimenez. We read this for my March Patreon book club, so I do have a spoilery vlog about it if you're interested in the Patreon. No pressure at all, but I do have a spoilery vlog over there, and we have a live discussion talking about it, and it was one of the best live discussions I've had about a book in a while. It's hard for me to explain the plot of The Vanishing Birds, but basically this is a science fiction novel. It's set far into the future, and essentially Earth has colonized different planets. These different planets serve different purposes, but the one planet that we focus on at the very beginning is called Ambe V, and Ambe V usually gets some off-worlders, as they call it, that come to their planet and give them resources or take resources to sell to other planets. And essentially one of the characters that you're following, named Calie, in this first chunk of the book, he falls in love with one of the off-worlders named Nia. And in the first chapter, you actually get to experience his life from being a child meeting Nia to being an old man. So the first part of this book almost reads like vignettes, and arguably the rest of the book tends to read like that just based off time jumps and how much time is being covered in this book. But otherwise, Calie is the only character that in a very short chapter you see his life from being a child to being an old man. And within his life story, you see Nia come in and out of his life, and the last time she comes into his life is because there was a crash landing on Ambe V, and it's this little boy who is an off-worlder. They don't know where he came from, they don't know how he got here, so they contact Nia and her crew to come check out this boy and maybe take him away, because the citizens of Ambe V aren't really doing well with this. They think it's a bad omen. So essentially you follow that small chunk of time to set up a larger story that's about Nia and this little boy. I hesitate to say it's like a cozy science fiction, but this feels cozy at times. There's such a found family element to it, and I hesitate to say, like, if you love The Long Way to a Smaller Planet, you'll love this, because I think the tone in The Long Way to a Smaller Planet is vastly different, but there's that similarity where Becky Chambers and Simon Jimenez are making larger commentary on colonization, on homophobia, on racism, xenophobia, and essentially, even though Earth is continuing to progress, you can't take the societal ideologies out of the people who came from that and have them colonize these planets and assume that we're just going to progress to this utopian type of world. It doesn't really work like that. And you see that in works like The Long Way to a Smaller Planet and The Vanishing Birds. I think The Vanishing Birds definitely goes deeper into it. You get to see Ambe V's progression through years and how their planet looked one way at the beginning of the story, and by the end it looks completely unrecognizable to you as the reader and to the people that have grown up there. But alongside these discussions, there is this found family aspect, and that's between Nia, her crew, and this little boy. And this little boy that Nia takes in, he doesn't really speak. He doesn't say his name. He only plays music. And there's been some obvious trauma in his life, which you slowly find out and unravel through these relationships being formed and this found family being formed. You get to see characters working through trauma, but you also get to see characters who haven't really worked through their trauma from childhood especially, and how they react to situations or how they decide to make decisions that can affect hundreds of thousands of people, if not the entire universe. It's a very hard book to describe because there are so many moving parts, and I don't want to give anything away, but I think that overarchingly, if you love science fiction just generally, you will enjoy this. But especially if you like science fiction that isn't necessarily like a space odyssey, but more like a space opera, kind of cozy sci-fi, a dash of found family, but a lot of deep philosophical discussions and discussions about our society that we deal with today. I also think that Simon Jimenez is one of the best writers that I've read in a while, where I was like sitting there, jaw on the floor, highlighting my book. I can probably show you. For example, this doesn't look like a lot, but there's actually this whole thing here that I have highlighted, and then these are all highlighted, some down here. Like, there are so many pages in this book like that. And I also think if you love rereading books to get more out of it, that The Vanished Birds is definitely something that you could reread a million trillion times and probably get something different from it every single time. So I absolutely want to reread The Vanished Birds. I just don't know if my heart can take it, because by the end I was sobbing. Sobbing. Every time I say things about why I like a book, I'm like, wow, I'm messed up. Anyway, that was my second 5-star of the year. And then I went back to my Robin Hobb bullshit, and then I marathoned the Rain Wilds Chronicles and the first 2 books and the Fits in the Fool trilogy. I can say that, like, collectively, I loved all of these books in different ways, except for City of Dragons. Don't understand why that book existed. But I will say the Rain Wilds Chronicle, only one book in there got a 4 stars, and that was Dragon Haven. The pacing and the plot were really well done in this one, and I think that it was the most exciting of the books. If the rest of the series would have kept that pace, I probably would have given the series overall a 4 stars. I ended up giving it a 3.5. Part of me wants to round it up to a 4 stars, but Dragon Haven is really the only one that got the 4 stars. Like, actually my heart said 4 stars, you know? I can't talk about it though, because this is the second to last quartet in a larger set of series, so it would spoil a lot, but it was fun. And then Fool's Assassin and Fool's Quest, which are the first 2 in the Fits in the Fool, I gave the first one a 4.5 and the second one 5 stars. Again, I can't really talk about it, but we are back with Fitz, who is the main character in the very first book, which is Assassin's Apprentice, and wow, it's emotional. I actually put off reading the last book because I just wasn't ready. I got 100 pages into it and I had to put it down because I knew that if I read it, I wouldn't be able to read anything else. So I don't know when I'll actually finish the series. I really thought that this would be the month that I'd be coming to you and being like, hey, I finished the whole Realm of the Elderlings in a year. Alas, I'm not here to say that because I'm avoiding devastation a little bit. The last 2 books of the month I actually gave 4 stars, and the first one is Kai. This was such an unexpected read for me, not because I thought I wasn't gonna like it. I actually thought that it was gonna be a banger, but because it was vastly different than what I thought it was gonna be. So this is a Hindu mythology retelling. You meet Kai at a very young age. I think she's like 8 or 9. She has 7 brothers, one of which is her twin. And she's actually fairly close to her brothers, but especially very close to her twin. One day, the kids find out that their mother was taken away with very little explanation as to what happened, and the explanation that is given to other people doesn't make sense to the kids. So Kai has really spent her whole, you know, adolescence trying to figure out what happened to her mother and why her father would lie about why he sent her away. Until one day her twin brother arranges a marriage for her without ever asking her if this is what she wanted, and she ends up going to another kingdom to be a wife. And this is where Kai's life kind of takes a turn. She starts to create sort of a feminist movement, and this is really because of the way that the men have treated her and other women in her life, starting with her father sending away her mother, but also with her twin brother arranging this marriage without her consent, without any of her say-so, and her husband, who she does end up becoming very close to in the story, but it is heavily emphasized that their marital arrangement is based off of her duty as a queen, but in actuality she's asexual, and that's heavily emphasized in the way that she talks about her and her husband's friendship and how she views him and how she views sex and marriage and relationships of the sort in general. That was the side tangent. Basically, she creates this feminist movement because of the men in her life that have done various things to her and to the women around her. And her husband gives her a little bit of autonomy to be like, yeah, you can help the women in our kingdom. And so she starts to sort of take on a role of what men normally have, but for these women. And one of her sons ends up being very against what she's doing and also tells her that she has upset the gods. And then she has an encounter where she has upset the gods and she sees it firsthand. So I really love this book because of the feminist topics. I really love Calie as a main character. She was a very well fleshed out, well written character, and I loved the asexual representation in here. I think that this just didn't get a 5-star from me because I don't really read a lot of retellings in general. I'm not sure that they are something that I love. I mean, Greek retellings are all over the place. They're everywhere. I know they're well loved, but I don't really have that much interest in Greek retellings. But I think my overarching problem in here was that there are a lot of side characters, and those side characters have some sort of tether to Calie, and I think you're supposed to really care deeply about these side characters, but I don't. Like, I think the closest I got to caring about a side character were the other women in Calie's life. So her husband has multiple wives, and they have a really beautiful relationship. I also did enjoy her twin brother for a time. They do have quite a close relationship for a good chunk of this book, and so you do end up liking him, sure. But I think that my connection to them was never strong enough for me to care about any of the situations that Calie found herself in with various people in her life. I think you were supposed to care deeply about them so that certain circumstances and situations that played out in here, you felt more deeply about them and you cared in those moments. But it's not that I didn't care. I cared about Calie's reaction to those situations, but I didn't care what was happening to other characters, if that makes sense. So I think my problem here is that I really love well fleshed out side characters. That's usually something that creates like a 5-star book for me, is having not only a well fleshed out main character or main characters, but also side characters that the main character is interacting with, and I just didn't feel that here. So that's why this was really lacking for me. But otherwise, I really enjoyed this story. I had a little bit of trouble getting into the first quarter of it, if not less than a quarter of it, but by the time I got over that hump, I ended up really loving the rest of this book. And then my last 4-star of the month was The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. This one was really fun because it was unexpected. So I had a premise in my mind when I first started reading it, which was slightly wrong, but how it unfolded and the main character's narration was just so delightful. Even though there are a lot of difficult conversations in here, COVID does exist in here. It takes place during 2020, and discussions on the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd. So there are some heavy discussions in here, but the narration of it, not that it makes light of any of those conversations, but the narrator just has this sense of humor about her and this way of looking at the world that I really appreciated, and it was extremely delightful. So essentially you're following our main character, Tookie, and in her 30s, she has a best friend who asks her to get the body of the supposed love of her life who happened to pass away, but he passed away in the arms of another woman because their relationship was very up and down. So Tookie, who is alluded to have been on some drugs at the time, said yes, and she stole a van from her work and transported the body. Little did she know that actually the two women were transporting large amounts of cocaine on his body. So Tookie ends up going to prison because of this situation, and her lawyer basically says to her, like, listen, I'm gonna try to get you out. Quite a few years later, he does succeed at getting her out, and she ends up becoming a bookseller at Birch Bark Books, which is Louise Erdrich's actual bookshop. So when Tookie becomes a bookseller, a customer actually passes away on All Souls Day and ends up haunting Tookie and this bookstore, and she doesn't know why, but she's under the impression that it's because she desecrated a body back in the day when she transported the body with a lot of cocaine. So she's kind of spending time trying to figure out how to help this customer move on and stop haunting her in the bookstore. But in that, she sort of finds out more about herself and more about this customer and more about books in general. And I loved it. It's like an homage to independent bookstores and books themselves and just like book lovers. This is very much for a book lover. Like I said, halfway through this book, COVID does happen, and there are discussions of COVID within the Indigenous community and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think those were done well, but I do think that the reason this got 4 stars was because the addition of those conversations on top of everything else that was already happening in the first like 70% of the plot, it just became too much, and I felt like we didn't get a lot of resolutions for certain things. We do get a resolution about the ghost situation, which is ultimately what I wanted, but other things I feel like they were added in, and I enjoyed the discussions, but it felt like there was too much happening. Otherwise, I think that Tookie is like one of my favorite narrators that I've read this year. She is so delightful. Like, her way of looking at life and even the situation is just so hilarious because she knows she's being haunted, but she kind of just goes about her life like, yeah, I'll figure it out. So I absolutely loved this, but I love Louise Erdrich, so I don't know what I expected. Like, I knew I was gonna love it. Okay, now getting into my stats. I want to give a big shout out to G from Book Roast because she has created the call pile method, and in that call pile method you get your stats, and so these are all from my stats of things that I have input. The only difference between my call pile sheet and Goodreads is that call pile says I've read 55 books, and that's because in there you can put in your DNFs. So it's not that it's counted as read, because I'm not counting those ones necessarily as read, but it's that I wanted to input them to see how many I've DNF'd and like why I've DNF'd them. So in theory, I have read 49 books this year and DNF'd 6 of those books. I have read a total of 2,259 pages, mainly because I hybrid read everything. So I've mostly put in things as my hours listened. And I have listened to a total of 532.65 hours. 75% of what I'm reading is hybrid reading the audio and physically reading it. I just like to do that. But the 2,259 is me raw dogging reading. I didn't listen to anything, I just read the book. So percentage wise, that means that 77% of my reading is on audio and 23% is physical. But again, I read most of them hybrid. I just count the audiobooks more because sometimes I'll listen to more of the book than I've hybrid read it. So I just count the hours. But also I think you can gather from my videos, I love audiobooks. I really love the idea of being able to put in headphones and do just things around my house all day. It makes me very productive. I play video games with audiobooks. I clean my house with audiobooks. I do all of my like chores and tasks with audiobooks. At work, if it is something that's a mindless task, listening to an audiobook. I just really like having a story playing. Also, depression, mental illness. 42.6% are standalone books and 57.4% are series. Speaking of series, I started 16 series this year, but I'm also counting like those little romance series that technically can be read as standalones, but they are series because a lot of them I'm reading through the series. I've read 9 sequels, finished 1 series, but I have DNF'd 7 series. In terms of genre, I've read 1.9% thrillers, 31.5% romance, 31.5% fantasy, 20.4% sci-fi, 7.4% horror, and 5.6% lit fic. This is not surprising, but only one aspect of it is surprising. I think people are gonna say the romance part, but I kind of knew romance would be higher since I started getting into romance at the end of last year. But it's that horror is lower. I think that's mainly because for whatever reason, as soon as it's like May and June, that's when I go full force into the horror and thriller genre. So this makes sense to me that quarter 1 would be lower with the horror. But I think romance and fantasy being neck and neck is a little surprising. And I also think that sci-fi being as high as it is would be surprising at a different point in my life. But right now, I had a lot of people picking sci-fi things for different videos that I was doing. So this is also not very surprising to me. In terms of age category, I read 9.3% YA, so 3 books were YA, and 90.7 books were adult, so 49. As for my star rating, my average star rating is a 3.6 stars, and I gave out 6.7% or 3 5-star ratings. I gave out 60% or 27 4-star ratings. I gave out 26.7% or 12 3-star ratings, and I gave out 6.7% or 3 2-star ratings. So it's not bad. I gave out a lot of 4 stars. So this next section is going to be how I acquired my books and how many books I started out with in the year versus how many I still have on my shelf. So I actually just counted before this video started. I'm not gonna say anything, but as you know, my #1 and pretty much only bookish goal this year was to read down my TBR. This has been something that I've been trying to do for the last 2 years, and this year I'm going like full steam ahead into it. I did pretty well last year, but I'm trying to do even better this year, and I'd love to have my TBR cut in half. So at the beginning of the year, I started out with 329 books on my physical TBR. This is not including Kindle, this is not including audiobooks. Mainly this is because the audiobooks that I do own, I did not buy them. I used the Libro FM librarian and influencer package to be able to get ALCs, which thank you so much. It's been such an amazing resource. And for the most part, I've probably already owned the physical book since I try to only get the Libro FMs that I'm planning on buying anyway. So my physical TBR at the beginning of the year was 329 books. And as of today, counting my physical TBR, I am at 306 books. Some of this is obviously me reading those 50 some odd books, and some of it is unhauling. I did bring in 15 physical books. In terms of how I acquire my books, 90.8% is based off of what I own, and 9.2% is from the library. I think that my library number in theory would be higher, but I didn't count doubles. So if I read it and I physically owned it, I just counted that as physically owned. But half the time when I'm listening to an audiobook, I do get it from the library. And as we know, I pretty much listen to an audiobook for most all books that I read. And lastly, my camera's gonna die. So let me get the battery so I could tell you some of my favorite books of the year. Okay, and lastly, I have 5, I would say, favorite books of the year. This was a little hard for me to pick in terms of like only 5 that I've read this year that I would say would probably make it into my top 10 of the year. So I have From Luca with Love by Mariana Zapata, Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez, of course, The Vanishing Birds, The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi, and either Fool's Assassin or Fool's Quest, more likely Fool's Quest if I'm honest with you. If I'm honest, Fool's Quest. Okay, so that was my 4 and 5 star reads as well as my quarter 1 stats. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you've made it this far and have nothing else to say, please leave a bird emoji down in the comments, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.